this next case study that we're going to get into, I think this one is really, really good at kind of establishing how ransomware can impact an organization. So if we follow this particular case with a through line here, this one started with a phishing email. It was a phishing email that was stealing the user's credentials. Once those credentials were obtained, they were used to log back into the system. And again, if you join these sessions a lot, you probably hear that that's something we talk about a lot, valid accounts being used, phishing for initial access. So this case kind of highlighted both of those. Now, once the actors got into the system, they took some measures to try to evade, defense that was on the system. So they actually bypassed and uninstalled some of the EDR tooling that was available. Fortunately, they weren't able to do that across the whole network. There was only like an area of the network that they were able to bypass the EDR tooling. But this still, even with this like small bypass, it still allowed them to encrypt part of the network with malware. Now, this was a big global network that they had hit here, and unfortunately, once this encryption started, there were critical services that couldn't be accessed, including their public-facing website. So at this time, employees couldn't access anything, so work could not continue. And then as well, for this particular case, they had a website where purchases could potentially be made, and customers couldn't access that. So every minute they were down, as that last illustration there shows, every minute they were down, they were losing money while the network was down. So this case study, we thought it was a really good one at kind of underscoring the importance of business continuity in these cases, because especially when a technology firm is hit, if they lose critical functions, that could impact not just them, but also any customers that those firms may have. So let's go over to the next slide here. And I want to talk about, kind of putting this in the big picture of technology firms, because this isn't the first time, right, that we've seen threat actors go after technology firms. This is a kind of an old favorite of threat actors. So we kind of have a trip down memory lane here with a timeline of some of the most notable cases involving significant technologies. And starting with Microsoft Exchange proxy logon that happened back in 2020, as well as SolarWinds was another one that happened in 2020. And I know I'm talking a lot here, so George, if there's anything you want to add on either of those cases, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the most memorable for me was probably proxy logon, just how widespread that campaign was. How huge that vulnerability was, and the type of access that it gave was sort of a perfect storm. So yeah, going all the way back sort of 4 years to 2020 now, that's a long old time ago. But we're still seeing more of these types of vulnerabilities today. Even the beginning of this year, I seem to remember as being pretty heavy for vulnerabilities. Moving through as well. Move it. That was a huge deal for us last year. There's a lot of work that Kroll did in analyzing the Move It vulnerabilities. The impact there, of course, was mostly because the technology that was being targeted because of the type of organizations that would use that technology downstream. So threat actors absolutely know that those implementations of various types of technology, in this case it was for file sharing, of course, it can have huge impact on many organizations by compromising maybe one piece of software. So yeah, it just again sort of underscores the fact that you need to be able to plan for these things, and when the worst does happen, be able to react to it properly, really.
Yeah, and some of the other notable ones that we saw were also Revil, the Kaseya supply chain attack in July of 2021. We're approaching the holiday season right now, so a lot of questions that I get from clients sometimes is, hey, what do you see, with respects to cyber threats in the holidays? And we typically see more activity, right? So SolarWinds, for a lot of people in cyber, I'm sure they remember that as happening around around Christmas. And then you had, Revil, Kaseya supply chain attack happened the July 4th weekend. Now then getting into 2022, we saw more targeting of technology firms. This was when the Lapsus group kind of went on a tear the first 2 months of that year. They were targeting multiple different technology firms. And really what they were doing was stealing a lot of data and then putting it up, making it publicly available. So source code available, IP available, and things like that. And then more recently, one of the large attacks that we observed in 2023 was related to MOVEit software. So it was really a targeting of a 0-day vulnerability in that software that ended up impacting hundreds and hundreds of organizations. And George is nodding his head because he remembers, like me, working on that one quite a lot.
Yes. I don't think I'm going to be forgetting that for a long old while. As I said before, MOVEit is one of those pieces of software specifically chosen for targeting. It happened last year. I don't think that's the last time it's going to happen. So that's one of those really serious sort of response actions that you're going to have to take at some point. You need to be ready for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm looking at our timeline here. I think proxy logon actually happened in 2021. Because I kind of remember SolarWinds happening end of 2020, and then we got into 2021 thinking, okay, get a little bit of a break, and then you have proxy logon starting, Revil, and all of that. So 2020 and 2021 were wild years working in cyber. So if we move over to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about what we were seeing in the last quarter, right? So one of the big stories, of this quarter, unfortunately, was the IT outages caused by the CrowdStrike, kind of known as the blue screen of death, that impacted organizations on July 19th. And this one was really a perfect storm for organizations. There had been an Azure outage the same evening that had come up, and about an hour or two later, faulty software update associated with CrowdStrike sent millions and millions of computers into this blue screen. And I remember waking up that morning at like 6 a.m. and I had, hundreds and hundreds of email messages. And that's when I'm glad I have a colleague like George that's in the UK, because they've already been working on it for a couple hours before I woke up. But George, tell us a little bit about what you were seeing that day.
Yeah, that was a pretty incredible Friday, and a Friday of all days for it to happen as well. Again, it's sort of one of those things where it could have easily been some kind of horrendous cyber attack. But in this case, it was just a faulty update that was just happened to be pushed to millions of devices. Of course, especially on the MDR side of the house, we're immediately working on that, trying to understand exactly what happened. I remember thinking the first portion of the day, we need to stand up our response plan for if a supplier is compromised, because you just have to sort of assume that to begin with. Thankfully, CrowdStrike put out messaging that quickly sort of set the situation straight, and we knew what we were dealing with. But again, these things take a lot of work. They take a lot of people power to put them right and understand the impact. And the impact in this case was pretty large. There was a pretty significant amount of outages. I remember here in the UK, at least, TV channels being offline because of it. It has sort of all of the hallmarks of a cyber attack. There's outages on the machines. I think we're just lucky in this case that it wasn't longer than it was, and the impact wasn't as severe as it would have been if it was some kind of cybercrime or nation state attack. So really, really interesting weekend, really long weekend.
Yeah, I think we were on the phone about all day that day. One of the things that really highlighted, though, was how dependent we all are on technology firms, right? So like even if we're not working in a technology firm, we're relying on technology to underpin, everything that we're doing. So it really highlighted that importance of business continuity planning for organizations. And I think this was something that we heard a lot from our clients in the weeks and months following that incident. And again, we were just lucky in that case that it wasn't some, malicious cyber attack, but it was kind of a way to highlight that interconnectedness across organizations. Now, a bit more of what we were seeing related to the technology sector in Q3, I want to touch on two different things. The first thing here, we talk about some nations. There was a lot of nation state activity this past year, if you've been following cyber news. And one of the campaigns that has been reported on quite a lot is the idea of nation state actors, particularly associated with North Korea, really impersonating IT employees or IT workers and attempting to infiltrate organizations. And there's been a lot of reporting on this on the last year. Now, if you joined the Q1 briefing that we did earlier this year, you'll know that we reported on a case that had a very similar fact pattern to that. At that time, a lot of the reporting on this wasn't available. And unfortunately, in that particular case, we didn't have a lot of logs to go on to kind of make some of these conclusions. But looking back, it's very likely that that employee impersonation case that we looked at in the first quarter was associated with this type of activity. And you could see that, one of the things that they were targeting there was the sensitive source code related to the organization. There were also multiple reports with Chinese-based threat actors in Q3. One of them was impacting the tech and telecom sector. This was a group that Microsoft is calling Salt Typhoon, but they had gained access to multiple U.S. telecommunications firms and internet service providers. And it kind of that one highlights another interesting thing when it comes to tech and telecom cases, because a lot of times the tech and telecom, it's not really the main target. Essentially, it's the target. It's where they get their foot in the door. But a lot of times the targets are those, the users on the end of the line. Particularly in that case with Salt Typhoon, particularly it was kind of targeting government organizations and surveilling those phone calls.